Okay, so these are just some of the considerations that we need to keep in mind when we are applying the assessment of whether they are still independent. But we look at substance over form, okay, over the legal form. Okay, so if our independent director is a significant provider of funding or finance, okay, or he is a representative of such a finance provider, or he participates in a share-based incentive scheme, or owns securities in the company, okay, the value of which is material to the director himself, or was in the position of an executive member in the last 3 years. Okay, those are just some of the examples of when conditions exist that could impair their independence. Okay, so if some of these factors are present, it could be that the director is not considered independent anymore, or is perceived as independent anymore. Okay, in terms of the composition of the governing body itself needs to disclose the fact that they are satisfied with the composition and that the mix of knowledge, skills, and experience is appropriate, and that whatever the targets for gender and race equity, whatever they are, and what the progress is that have been made towards those targets as yet. Okay, the different categories of non-executive directors need to be disclosed as well, whether they are independent or not. Okay, so the chair to the governing body needs to be an independent non-executive director. Okay, then the lead independent director, okay, needs to be an independent non-executive as well. Okay, so the purpose of the lead independent is to lead the governing body in the absence of the chair. Okay, so should the chair not be able to attend a certain meeting, then the lead independent director will then step in and fulfill the role of the chairperson. Okay, he also serves as a sounding board to the chair where they need to discuss certain items, or where the chair has the deciding vote. Okay, the chair can then consult with the lead as well. Okay, the lead also acts as the intermediary between the chair and other members if necessary, where there are, for example, conflicts or anything that requires an intermediary. The lead then acts as the intermediary between the chair and other governing body members. Okay. The lead independent also strengthens the identity of the board. It strengthens the independence of the board and the way the company is perceived. Okay, because the more independent directors there are, it shows a level of take the good corporate governance and having taking seriously the corporate governance principles that need to be applied. Okay. The lead independent also deals with shareholder concerns. Okay. And where the chair has a conflict of interest, that is then where the lead steps in. Okay, that these different roles need to be documented in the charter. Okay, just remember that CEO may not be the chair of the governing body. Okay, if it is a retired CEO, it must not be a retired CEO within the past 3 years. He should not have been the CEO within the preceding 3 years. Okay, please remember that succession planning needs to be appropriately implemented. So the governing body needs to have a strategy for how this chair is going to be replaced once their term comes to an end. Okay, so this is just another summary of the different committees, okay, and the chair's role on these committees. Okay, so these are the standard committees that we expect to have on the governing body: the Audit Committee, Remuneration, Nomination, Risk, Social and Ethics. Okay, and then what the chair's involvement may be. The chair may not be a member of the Audit Committee. He may be a member of Remuneration, Nomination, Risk, okay, but he may not chair the Remuneration Committee, as well as the Social and Ethics. All the others, he may be a member and he may also chair. Okay. In terms of delegating, okay, The governing body, we said, has the ultimate responsibility for the overall strategic objectives of the entity, okay? But it can delegate some of its duties to the committees, okay? So it could be standing committees. Standing committees are the standard committees that meet on a standing basis, either quarterly or as they see fit. Or it could be an ad hoc committee that is established for a certain purpose only, and then once that purpose is fulfilled, it is disbanded. Okay. It could also delegate to individual members, okay, but then this should be in writing and approved by the governing body. Okay. This authority that is delegated needs to be evaluated annually, and all of the committees that are established within the delegation of duties need to have formal terms of reference. Okay. In the terms of reference needs to be included the composition of the committee, what is the criteria for the appointment, roles and responsibility, what is their delegated authority, the tenure of the committee, when and how they meet, their access to resources and info, the meeting procedures, and arrangements for evaluating their performance. Okay, so the committee as a whole should also have the appropriate skills, knowledge, and experience. Okay, what we spoke about before for the governing body as a whole, that also applies to the subcommittees as well. Okay, you also have a minimum of 3 members. Okay, the executive and senior management, they can be invited to attend these meetings, okay, where they act as observers only. Okay, and they're not allowed to participate without the chair's consent. They may not vote, and they're not entitled to fees for attendance at these meetings where there are observers, unless the governing body and the shareholders agree that they may receive fees. Okay. Okay, so the following disclosures need to be made to the governing body. The subcommittee needs to disclose to the governing body, and then this is also included in the integrated report as well. The roles and responsibilities, the function of the committee, members' qualifications and experience, whether they had any invitees to their meetings or external advisors, what were their focus areas, the number of meetings and the attendance at the meetings, and whether they themselves are satisfied with the fact of whether they have fulfilled their responsibility. Okay. So an audit committee could be a statutory requirement by some organizations or for companies. It's required, and if it is audited, then an audit committee is also required. Okay. So the role of the audit committee is to play an independent oversight role on the effective assurance function. They need to ensure the integrity of the financial statements, okay, which is being presented to members of the public, to various different stakeholders. Okay. So the members, it's therefore crucial that they have financial literacy, skills, and experience. Okay. All of the members on the audit committee need to be independent non-executives. Okay. They meet annually with both the internal and external auditors present, okay, without management present, okay, so as to avoid any undue influence. Okay, they look at the quality of the external audit reported, the effectiveness of the chief audit executive, okay, who's in charge of the audit function in the organization, the effectiveness of the CFO and the entire finance team, okay, and also the effectiveness of the internal controls. Nominations Committee are responsible for nominating, electing, and appointing members of the governing body. Okay, we've already spoken about how they should do that. They should ensure that the appropriate succession plan is in place. And then the Nomination Committee is also responsible for the evaluation of performance of the governing body. We've already said that only those well-performing directors could be up for re-election after their term ended. How will we know if they have performed appropriately in fulfilling their roles and responsibilities? That is then evaluated by the Nominations Committee. Okay. All of the members on the Nomination Committee should be non-executive. Okay. However, a majority of those non-executive need to be independent. Okay. The chairman of the governing body can be a member and he can chair the Nominations Committee as well. The Risk Governance Committee has the responsibility for the monitoring and oversight of risk governance. Okay. Sometimes the Risk Committee is there's a composite committee where it is the Audit and Risk Committee. It's together. It's one committee. But it could be that the Risk Committee could also be separate to the Audit Committee. But it could be that the members could have joint membership. Okay, one member could have joint membership between the risk and the audit committee, so as to liaise and have effective functioning between the two committees. Okay, so it should have a balance of members of executives versus non-executive, majority being non-executive on the governing body. But there is no requirement to have a majority independent non-executives. Chairman of the governing body can be a member and he can chair the risk committee as well. Remuneration committee, all of the members need to be non-executive. Majority of those non-execs they need to be independent. The chairman of the governing body can be a member of the remuneration, but he may not chair the remuneration committee. The remuneration committee needs to be chaired by another independent non-executive director. Okay, in terms of Regulation 43 of the South African Companies Act, some companies require social and ethics committee. Okay, so where there is a social and ethics committee on the board of directors or the governing body, there should be a balance of executive and non-executive. However, the majority should then be non-executive. No requirement for the majority being independent on the governing body. Chairperson of the governing body may be a member of the Social and Ethics Committee, but the chair of the governing body may not chair the Social and Ethics Committee. Okay, because it could be that there is a complaint, an ethical complaint, which may be directed at the chair of the governing body, then he cannot be the chair of the governing body, of the Social and Ethics Committee, who then hears this complaint and investigates the complaint further. Okay, so here's just another summary of the different committees and the memberships. Okay, the roles and responsibility, what they are responsible for all of the different committees. Okay. In terms of Principle 9, okay, the governing body should ensure that it pays an evaluation of its own performance, of its committees, of the chair, and the individual members of the committees, so as to support continuous improvement. Okay. So every second year, the governing body needs to be evaluated, their performance, but annually the subcommittee's performance needs to be evaluated. Okay, so the evaluation is led then by an independent non-executive, okay, or otherwise then the lead independent. Okay, if there's no lead independent, then it would just then be another independent non-executive director who takes over that role. Okay, it is a formal process. The evaluation is a formal process, and the method of how this evaluation should be conducted, that should be approved by the governing body after the evaluation is done. There should be sufficient time to reflect on performance and suggest areas for possible future improvement. Okay. So the governing body should appoint the CEO, and the governing body should also measure the CEO's performance. The CEO may not be a member of the Remuneration, Audit, or Nomination Committee, but he could be an invitee. He could attend by invitation. Okay. The CEO and the governing body should collectively agree before the CEO takes up additional professional positions. Okay, so that is just to ensure that the CEO has sufficient time to spend on the affairs of the company at hand. Okay. The governing body should implement a succession plan for the CEO, for the role of the CEO. And in terms of the CEO, the notice period in the employment contract and other professional commitments that the CEO has, and whether there's succession planning in place, all of that then needs to be appropriately disclosed in an integrated report. Okay, in terms of governing risk in the organization, the governing body should treat risk as an integral, okay, that is important, fundamental way to decision making. Okay, they need to look at potential upside and downside risk as well. Okay, and approve and implement a policy that articulates and sets the direction for risk. But obviously, we are also responsible for the ongoing monitoring and oversight of risk and risk management, and they need to assess whether there's a need for independent assurance on their risk management. Okay, could be that they engage external auditors to just assess whether their risk management and risk governance process, the risk register that is set up, whether that is appropriate. Okay, so the governing body also assumes responsibility for the governance of IT. There should be an appropriate IT policy which needs to be approved. The governing body provides appropriate oversight over how this IT policy applies to laws, whether it is ethical, its use thereof is ethical, whether how the obsolete technology will be disposed of, whether that is done in a responsible and accountable manner, the performance of outsourced systems or outsourced partners or third parties or external parties that is used, how that those contracts or agreements are managed, the integration of a company-wide system or an organizational-wide system, the arrangements to provide business resilience, IT security, and then the very important, the protection of private information. So just think about how we are all completing registers as we go into shops or malls or whatever the case may be, wherever we enter into these days, where you have to fill in your personal information. That organization where we as customers or clients or patients we enter into, they need to ensure the confidentiality and the protection of your personal and private information. Okay, so in terms of the ultimate compliance with the country's laws and regulations, the governing body has ultimate responsibility for that. They need to approve a policy, okay, that sets the direction for compliance, how we're going to achieve compliance with all of the laws and regulations. They monitor the compliance process. There should be a periodic review, or they need to consider whether there's a need for a periodic review of these policies. And then they need to report on any material contraventions or repeated regulatory penalties or repeated regulatory contraventions, and how they are and provide details of how they are monitoring compliance with these regulations. Okay, so in terms of the remuneration policy, okay, the remuneration policy should be fair, responsible, and transparent, and it should attract, motivate, reward, and retain the desired human capital. Okay, the remuneration policy should also promote an ethical culture. Okay, it should have an appropriate balance of remuneration, variable and fixed, so as to achieve strategic objectives, so that it does not promote greed and unethical behavior, corruption, bribery, fraud within an organization. Okay, so there are certain aspects that need to be included in a remuneration committee report that is found on pages 65, 66 of the King report. Okay, just remember that there are certain Companies Act requirements in terms of the voting on the remuneration policy. Okay, voting and whether you voted against or did not vote against the policy being implemented. Okay. So the remuneration could be set out in terms of a base salary, then having some financial incentives and non-financial incentives. Could have a proportion of variable remuneration that encourages long-term and short-term growth, and it has long-term and short-term incentives to encourage those growth objectives. Okay. Could be that there is a policy for appropriate sign-on, um, retention of directors or retention of skills, and then an appropriate restraint of trade agreement in place. Okay, so there could be conditions for pre-vesting and post-vesting, and how that is forfeited, where certain incentives have contingencies attached to that. Okay, there could be allowances and commissions, and then certain fees, sitting fees or attendance fees for non-executive members of the governing body needs to be articulated in the policy as well. Okay, in order for this, the shareholders then need to vote on and they need to approve this remuneration policy as appropriate or not. Okay, so we've already touched on combined assurance. Once again, the governing body assumes responsibility for that. Um, they need to enable an effective internal control environment, and they need to be satisfied that the combined assurance model um, is appropriate and the services that are applied are appropriate for the environment of the entity. Okay. So in terms of the external reports, okay, that is now the integrated report, and any other report that is issued, governing body assumes responsibility for that as well, and they need to take into account any legal requirements. Okay. The nature of the report is suited for the audience and the purpose. Okay, and it discusses the assurance function, the services, and the processes. Okay. For the internal audit function, the governing body also assumes responsibility, and they need to approve the internal audit charter, okay, which once again defines the roles and responsibilities. The chief audit executive within the organization, that role needs to be filled by a person independent from management who carries appropriate authority. That appointment also needs to be approved by the governing body. That chief audit executive is in charge of the internal audit department. He needs to have direct access to and report directly to the chair of the audit committee. Okay, he cannot be a member of executive management or of the executives, okay, but he could be invited to attend executive meetings and provide input as appropriate. Okay, so in terms of the stakeholder inclusive approach, we've already discussed that, okay, where the balance of the needs and interests and expectations of material stakeholders are done to the best interest of the company over time. Okay, so the governing body needs to assume responsibility for the stakeholder inclusive approach, and they need to approve a policy about the direction and how they are going to balance stakeholder relationships. So, how they are going to exercise their oversight on the methodologies, the focus areas, dispute resolution, and outcomes of the stakeholder relationships. Okay. So, in terms of stakeholder relationships, some of the key stakeholders are like the shareholders, how they interact with the AGM, the external auditors also invited to the AGM, the directors are available at the AGM for answering questions. The shareholders should be equitably treated. Okay, and then the minutes of the AGM are publicly available so that other stakeholders could also assess appropriately. Okay, the holding company and a group of company, they assume responsibility for the governance across the group in all aspects, even if it is across all jurisdictions if they operate in different jurisdictions. Okay, so an institutional investor, the governing body of an institutional investor, should ensure that a responsible investment strategy is practiced by the organization so as to promote good governance and the creation of value by companies and invest. This is now, for example, GIPF. For argument's sake, they should ensure that they have good corporate governance, and they need to create value in the companies in which they invest. This is Principle 17, and it is not likely to be examined, okay, because it is sector specific. Okay, so the sector supplements are not examinable, okay, but they need to be read together with the King report, okay. All of the other outcomes, principles, and recommended practices of the principles apply, okay, and now it is just broken down and applied into a variety of different sectors and organizational types. Okay, part 7 of the code focuses on the content development in the King Committee. Okay, that is also not examined.